As a longtime follower of right-wing YouTube, you begin to see certain things come up as a matter of course in the conversation. Critiques of the left, the ineffectual and inept bumbling of conservatism incorporated, the onslaught of degeneracy in modern society. Increasingly, in more recent times, are discussions of race, particularly around 2016, 2017, and what was then known as the alt-right. You also see a certain skepticism toward what is called capitalism, dissections of democracy, a reiterated need for the right to be willing to take power in a Nietzschean manner, and so on. While these positions are not necessarily without merit, they are, as a general rule, materialist at root. You don't tend to see many commentators approaching the plight of modern man in society outside this paradigm. Some possible exceptions to this are the distributist's Catholic perspective or the vague neo-paganism of somebody like Vard Vikernes or Philosophicat. One of the more fascinating things to see in dissident right circles, something I never saw growing up, is that the right has adopted some of the deconstructionist weapons of the left. The power of critique. The tools of the left are starting to be turned on their masters. Increasingly, the modus operandi of people on the right seems to be to deconstruct the assumptions and the worldview of the left instead of engaging in the unsuccessful holding operation which conservatives, ever the heel men and honorable losers, have been trying their hands at for years. For decades, conservatives have been engaged in a rearguard action, taking casualty after casualty as Western civilization plods along like Saruman's hapless Uruk-hai, dwindling and harried across the plains to the edge of Fangorn Forest, dogged by the riders of Rohan, where they are at last destroyed. If the erstwhile conservative movement are Saruman's Uruk-hai, the modern dissident right are something more akin to the Nazgul. Small minority operating largely in the shadows and striking where their opponents philosophically fear while consciously hunting for the ring of power. The strategy of the right has become more of an offensive effort rather than a reactive, defensive one. It's a method that sets the terms of the debate and refuses to meet the left on their own ground, and in that way it is admirable. The dissident right and even some of the more with-it paleo-libertarians are attempting to hack at the rotten roots of the cultural ideological left rather than taking on individual issues. While effective, however, the issue with critique is that it is by its very nature a destructive endeavor rather than a constructive one. And the big question underlying the various voices of the right should be why? What are we fighting for, and why is our vision of society a worthy one? Why is Western civilization worth preserving in the first place, aside from purely aesthetic or pseudo-Darwinian reasons? There seems to be a general self-awareness among people on the right for the need of something more. There's a recognition for the need of the transcendent by a lot of these people, but it's seldom identified, or is touched on only in passing. Countercurrent's editor-in-chief Greg Johnson proposes making whiteness itself a kind of civic religion. This is a suggestion that we make a literal idol out of the white race as something to rally behind and be revered. This is a rather bizarre and absurd notion, since Western civilization at large has never seen itself as white nationalist, any more than black Africans consider themselves black nationalists or Arabs Arab nationalists. Attempts to forge racial nationalism seem in all places and all times to be a synthetic pipe dream more than reality and more a projection of their respective leaders' obsessions with racial thinking. This isn't to say that race is merely a social construct and that there aren't differences between people groups, but to act as if it were to be the be-all end-all or even the most important thing is absurd. Likewise with power. Power is important, but it's not everything, and corrupt, degenerate society will tend to produce corrupt, degenerate outcomes. This is where people need to go beyond the political dialectic of left and right thinking in order to reach for the good, beautiful, and true, so as to resurrect the noble from society, and indeed from ourselves. The foundation for building lasting, stable, and socially conservative societies in the West has been there all along, and is no real secret. It's Christianity, Christendom. Any attempt to strive for so-called new forms or constructing some kind of civic religion based on race or anything else is insufficient and synthetic. As the late Ravi Zacharias once said, truth by definition is exclusive. And by knowing it, one can be freed by it, and the Logos, Christ himself, is the eternal truth. While there seems to be tacit approval of Christianity among most of the dissident right, generally speaking, there has to be much wider and frank discussion of the role of Christianity and the necessity it will play going into the future. Ultimately, man's problem is sin. While some on the right may point to the failings of modern churches in an effort to deny Christianity and embrace a nihilistic will to power, or LARP as modern-day pagans, minus the less desirable aspects of heathenry, like human sacrifice or ritual rape, at the end of the day, it was the church which stood preeminent in the West for well over 1,000 years. In contrast, modern secularist, rightist ideas about how to organize society have been and are likely to remain purely theoretical or end in disaster. In the final analysis, the battle we're fighting, while having a political dimension, is ultimately a war for the soul of man. And politics is not enough.